The dean's voice didn't need a microphone to cut the room. Your grandfather, she said, letting the pause do the work, the biker. What could he possibly know about Rachmaninoff? A few people laughed the way people do when they want to be seen agreeing. Ridge Cole didn't flinch. He sat in the back row where he always sat, shoulders square, hands folded, eyes forward. Leather vest, silver beard, boots that still had highway dust on them. He looked like somebody the Academy had decided was a problem before he even breathed. Savannah Cole stood near the side of the stage with her music folder held too tight against her chest, feeling the heat rise up her neck, feeling the room tilt. She had heard judges say cruel things before, but there was something sharper about this, like the insult wasn't aimed at her grandfather alone, like it had been thrown at her and meant to stick. Dean Lillian Harrow didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She had that polished tone that made unkindness sound like policy. Savannah, she continued, you are on scholarship. Scholarship carries expectations. Standards. We are all responsible for maintaining them. The word standards landed heavy, and Ridge finally moved, not with anger, not with drama, just a calm shift like he was setting a cup down. He stood, and the room went quiet in that sudden embarrassed way, as if everyone realized at once they had been laughing in front of the person they were laughing at. Ridge looked toward Harrow, then toward Savvy, then back to Harrow. I think she can handle standards, he said. No threat in it. No pleading either. Just certainty. Harrow's expression tightened for half a second, then smoothed out again like she was pulling a sheet flat. I'm sure your confidence is well meant, she replied, but this is a conservatory. We take training seriously. Savvy wanted to disappear. She wanted to speak. She wanted to grab her folder, walk out, never come back. But she didn't. She stayed, because she'd stayed through worse. She'd stayed through the day the scholarship letter arrived, and her hands shook so hard she couldn't hold the envelope. She'd stayed through the first week at the academy when her roommate's parents flew in from out of state just to bring her a better lamp for her desk and a new bench for her upright piano, while Savvy unpacked thrift store hangers and a second-hand keyboard with 2 keys that didn't work right. She'd stayed through auditions where the other students sounded like they'd been raised in rooms built for music, while she sounded like she'd been raised above a mechanic's garage, because she had. She practiced in a space that smelled like oil and old tires, learned to ignore the clank of tools, learned to keep time even when the world around her didn't. She learned early that if you didn't have perfect conditions, you made your own. That was how she got here. That was how she earned a place in a room that still looked at her like she was a guest who stayed too long. Harrow knew all that on paper. Scholarship student. Rust Belt town. Deceased mother. Guardian grandfather with a record. Harrow didn't say those words. She didn't need to. The room said them back with every glance. 2 weeks earlier, Harrow had called Savvy into her office after rehearsal and shut the door with a quiet click. She had leaned back in her chair like she was about to give kindly advice. For your spring recital, she said, choose something accessible. Something that demonstrates technical competence without overreaching. Savvy had stared at the framed programs on Harrow's wall, names printed in elegant fonts, alumni who went on to big stages. Harrow had continued, carefully. The program should reflect what a student has genuinely mastered. Not what they hope to master someday. Savvy knew exactly what was being said. Stay in your lane. Don't embarrass us. Don't embarrass yourself. Don't remind anyone you came from somewhere they don't respect. Savvy had nodded and said she understood. Then she walked out, went back to her apartment, and sat in front of her keyboard until midnight without playing a note. On the stand was Chopin, safe, beautiful, approved. She loved Chopin. That wasn't the point. The point was that she hadn't chosen it. The point was that someone else's opinion of what she deserved had crawled into her hands. Ridge had never talked much about the academy. He drove her to lessons when she was little, worked late nights, paid tuition on time even when it meant putting off repairs on the garage, sat in the back row of school auditoriums with his vest hanging off the chair behind him. When her mom died, he showed up 8 hours later and brought her home without making her feel like a burden. When Savvy had her first real breakdown at 17, curled on the kitchen floor after a scholarship audition went wrong, Ridge had sat down on the linoleum next to her and stayed there, silent, steady until the crying passed. He didn't say it would be fine. He didn't offer clichés. He just remained. That was Ridge, the kind of man who didn't announce what he felt. He proved it by being there. At the rehearsal 2 weeks before the recital, Ridge had driven 4 hours to watch. He didn't have to, he always did. He came with 2 men from his chapter, Devlin and Ox, both large, both quiet, both carrying themselves like people who had learned patience the hard way. The moment they walked in, the room adjusted around them. The whispers started early, The eyes flicked toward the leather, the patches, the boots. Savvy tried not to look back, tried to keep her focus on the keys, tried to pretend she wasn't aware of every judgment hovering in the air. She played the Chopin the way she could play it in her sleep, clean, controlled, pretty. Harrow stopped her, not to correct her playing but to correct the room's perception. "We take seriously," Harrow said, turning slightly so parents could hear, "the question of whether a student's home environment supports the disciplined culture classical training demands." Savvy felt the words like a slap. Harrow didn't point. She didn't need to. Heads turned toward the back row. A woman in front whispered something to her husband. Ridge sat very still. Devlin's jaw tightened. Ox closed his eyes like he was counting to 10. Harrow finished with her favorite word. Standards. That was when Ridge stood and said calmly, "I think she can handle standards." Then Harrow, with her cool smile, asked Savvy to continue as if nothing had happened. That night, Savvy went back to her apartment and stared at her keyboard until her eyes burned. The Chopin sat there like an agreement she'd never signed. She kept thinking about the piece she had wanted to play since she first heard it, Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto. It was the kind of piece people talked about like a dare. Even the good students respected it. Some feared it. It demanded everything: speed, strength, control, nerve. It also demanded a kind of stubborn belief that you belonged in the room with it. Savvy had been practicing parts of it in secret for months. Not because she wanted to show off. Because it made her feel honest. Because when she played it, she wasn't trying to be acceptable. She was trying to be real. She knew what Harrow would say if she announced it. She knew what the faculty would do if she failed in public. She knew the word scholarship would become a chain around her ankle. She also knew she could live the rest of her year playing what people gave her and never once giving them the part of her that actually wanted to fight. Ridge knocked at 9, the same knock he'd always used, short and certain, and then he let himself in before she could say come in. He looked at her face, then at the stand, then at the Chopin pages sitting there untouched. "You haven't played," he said. It wasn't a question. Savvy tried to laugh it off. "I'm just tired." Ridge didn't argue. He set his keys down on the counter, took off his jacket, sat in the chair by the window like he'd done 100 times, and stared at the music for a few seconds. Then he said something that made Savvy's stomach drop. "You're still stuck on the third movement," he said, like he was talking about a place he'd been. Savvy turned slowly. "What did you say?" Ridge didn't look up at first. His eyes stayed on the stand, on the pages that weren't even open to Rachmaninoff. Savvy felt heat in her face again, but this time it wasn't shame, it was confusion. "Gramps," she said, keeping her voice light because the alternative felt too big, "how do you know anything about that?" Ridge finally looked at her, and there was something in his expression she couldn't name. Not guilt, not pride, something older. He stood, walked to the keyboard, sat down with the ease of someone who didn't need to ask permission from an instrument, and put his hands on the keys. "Show me what you've got," he said. Savvy hesitated. "You can't just..." Ridge didn't push. He waited. That was the thing about him. Even when he was firm, he wasn't forceful. Savvy pulled the Rachmaninoff pages out from under the Chopin like she was pulling a secret out of a drawer. She set them on the stand, heart hammering. Ridge didn't read. He didn't lean in. He didn't squint at the notes. He just shifted his fingers slightly, as if adjusting something in the air, and said, "Start where you fall apart." Savvy swallowed and began to play the passage that had been haunting her for weeks. She got 3 measures in before her hand tensed and the rhythm went uneven. Ridge lifted one finger. "Stop." He said it gently, but it carried weight. Savvy stopped. Ridge reached over, not touching her hand yet, just hovering, and said, "Your thumb is too high. You're fighting the run." Savvy stared at him. "How do you know that?" Ridge finally touched her hand, 2 fingers precise, the smallest correction, and her whole arm loosened like a knot coming undone. "Again," he said. Savvy played it. It was cleaner. Ridge nodded once, not praise, just confirmation. "Slower," he added. She played it slower, and it got cleaner still. Ridge took his hands off the keys and looked at her, and for a moment Savvy thought he was going to make a joke, pretend he'd guessed. But he didn't. He turned back to the keyboard and played the passage himself, not showing off, not performing, just demonstrating the shape of it the way someone demonstrates how to lift something heavy without hurting your back. The notes came out like they'd been waiting behind his knuckles for years. Savvy felt her throat tighten. "Who are you?" she asked before she could stop herself. Ridge's mouth twitched, not a smile. "I'm your grandfather," he said. Savvy shook her head. "That's not what I mean." Ridge sat still for a long second, hands resting on his knees. Then he stood and walked to her tiny kitchen, opened a drawer like he knew exactly where everything was, because he did, and pulled out a dish towel to wipe a small spot of grease off his fingers. He moved like a man used to keeping his hands useful. "I trained," he said finally. "A long time ago." Savvy felt the world tilt again, but differently now. Trained where? Ridge didn't answer immediately. He came back, sat down again, and looked at the Rachmaninoff pages like they were a person he hadn't seen in a long time. "Whitmore," he said. "Conservatory." Savvy's mouth went dry. "Like the Whitmore Conservatory?" Ridge nodded once. "Class of '89. Savvy stared at him so hard her eyes hurt. "You went to Whitmore and you never told me?" Ridge's jaw tightened. "There wasn't a reason," he said, and Savvy heard the lie in it. Not a malicious lie, a protective one, the kind people tell when the truth is heavy. "There was every reason," she whispered. Ridge didn't argue. He just looked tired for a moment, like he'd been holding a door shut for years and it had finally started to open. Savvy took a breath. "Were you good?" Ridge's eyes flicked to her, and there was a warning there, like he didn't want her to turn this into worship. "I did fine," he said. Savvy almost laughed at how impossible that sounded after what she just heard. "People called me talented," Ridge added, like he was reciting someone else's opinion. "I had a scholarship." Savvy leaned forward. "Why did you stop?" Ridge's gaze moved away. "Not tonight," he said. Savvy felt something rise in her, not anger, something steadier. "Tonight is exactly when," she said, then surprised herself with how certain she sounded. She gestured at the pages. "They're telling me to play small because of you. Because of where I come from. Because of what you look like when you walk into their little room." Ridge's expression hardened, and it wasn't the academy that did it. It was the idea of someone touching Savvy with that kind of contempt. "They don't know me," he said. "They don't have to," Savvy shot back. "They're using me to prove what they already believe." Ridge sat there a moment, thinking, and Savvy realized something. He wasn't deciding whether he wanted to help. He was deciding what it would cost her if he did. "If you play this," Ridge said, tapping the Rachmaninoff pages with one knuckle, "you can't half-play it. You can't survive it. They'll smell that. You either own it or you don't." Savvy nodded slowly. "Then help me own it," she said. Ridge looked at her, and for the first time that night, the softness in him showed up as something sharp, commitment. "Again," he said, and when Savvy put her hands back on the keys, she felt the tiniest shift inside herself, like she'd stepped onto a road she couldn't turn back from. Ridge leaned in slightly, listening, not to the beauty of it but to the truth of it, and as Savvy started the passage one more time, he spoke under his breath in a voice only she could hear, the voice of someone who knew exactly where the cliff edge was. "You're still on the third movement," he repeated, and this time it didn't sound like a comment, it sounded like a promise. Over the next 6 weeks Ridge did not turn into a different person, and that was the first thing that unsettled Savvy. He didn't suddenly start talking like a professor or telling stories about Europe or using words like phrasing and interpretation the way her academy instructors did. He showed up in the same truck, or sometimes on the bike if the weather held, knocked once, walked in, set his keys down and said, "Where did you leave it?" The first night after he admitted Whitmore, Savvy expected some kind of grand explanation, some confession about a lost career or a betrayal or a scandal that would make sense of why a man who could play like that had spent the last 30 years under fluorescent lights fixing transmissions. Instead, he rolled his shoulders once, sat at her keyboard, and said, "From the top." Savvy stared at him. "The top." Ridge nodded. "If you're going to do it, we don't practice the safe parts." There was no ceremony. No dramatic speech about reclaiming glory. Just work. Savvy started the first movement of Rachmaninoff's third the way she had practiced it alone, careful, measured, slightly guarded. Ridge stopped her 12 measures in. "You're protecting yourself," he said. Savvy frowned. "I'm controlling it." Ridge shook his head once. "You're apologizing to it." The words hit harder than she expected. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. He wasn't wrong. Every difficult run, every stretch, every moment that demanded strength, she was negotiating with it instead of taking it. "Again," he said. "But don't ask permission this time." She tried. She failed. She tried again. He didn't soften his tone when she got frustrated. He didn't raise it either. "Slower. Again. Listen." That was most of what he said. When she got something right, he didn't clap or smile. He just moved on to the next problem like it was obvious she could handle it. By the third session, Savvy's hands were sore in places she didn't know had muscles. By the fourth, she realized something that made her stomach twist. Ridge wasn't just good. He was precise in a way she had only seen in masterclasses. He heard things before they happened. He would stop her before she hit the wrong emphasis, like he could feel it coming through her wrists. One night, halfway through the second movement, she lost the thread and swore under her breath. Ridge didn't react to the language. He leaned forward slightly. "Why are you rushing that line?" Savvy blinked. "I'm not." Ridge held her gaze. "You are." She replayed it in her head. He was right. She was pushing through the quieter section, afraid of sitting in it too long, afraid of being exposed in the softness. Ridge nodded toward the keys. "That's where they'll decide if you belong," he said quietly. "Not in the loud parts. Anyone can be loud." Savvy swallowed. "You think they're waiting for me to mess up?" Ridge didn't answer immediately. He looked at her the way he used to when she was little and asked questions she already knew the answer to. "Yes," he said finally. The honesty hurt. It also steadied her. Devlin stopped by one evening with a box of takeout balanced in his hands. He didn't knock loudly. He just leaned against the doorframe and listened for a while before stepping inside. Savvy was in the middle of a brutal passage in the third movement, fingers flying, jaw tight. She stumbled, slammed a key too hard, and jerked back. "Again," Ridge said from beside her. Devlin raised his eyebrows. "You're running her like boot camp," he said lightly. Ridge didn't look up. "She asked me to." Devlin watched Savvy reset her hands. "You sure you want this one, kid?" he asked her. Savvy didn't stop looking at the keys. "I'm sure." Devlin studied her for a second longer, then nodded once like that was enough. He disappeared into the kitchen and came back with 3 forks and no plates. Ox came another night and didn't say a word at all. He sat on the couch with his arms folded and eyes closed, listening like he was memorizing something. The apartment felt small when they were all there, the air thick with concentration, but Savvy never once felt mocked. Not by them. Ridge didn't talk about Whitmore again. He didn't bring up professors or competitions. But sometimes when she hit a passage exactly right, something flickered across his face, a recognition that went deeper than pride. Once, after she nailed a brutal run in the first movement without hesitation, he leaned back and exhaled slowly. "That's it," he said. Savvy laughed, breathless. "That's what?" "That's the part where you stop asking if you're allowed to be here." She stared at him. "Were you ever scared?" The question slipped out before she could filter it. Ridge's eyes shifted, just slightly. "Of the music?" he asked. Savvy nodded. Ridge considered it. "No," he said. Then, after a beat, "I was scared of losing it." Savvy waited, hoping he would say more. He didn't. He tapped the page. Third movement. As recital night got closer, the academy grew tighter around her. Harrow's comments became more pointed, though never openly hostile. "You've been spending extra hours in the practice rooms," she observed one afternoon, glancing at Savvy's schedule. "Ambition is admirable, but exhaustion shows." Savvy forced a polite smile. "I'll be ready." Harrow's gaze lingered. "I hope so." Word traveled quietly among students. A few of them pulled Savvy aside. "Are you really switching to Ratch 3? One whispered. Savvy didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it either. She practiced in odd hours to avoid the curious looks. But looks found her anyway. Some were skeptical. Some were sympathetic. A few were almost eager, the way people get when they think they're about to witness a mistake that proves something. The night before the recital, Savvy sat alone at her keyboard long after Ridge left. Her fingers hovered over the opening chords. She thought about the scholarship. About the loan papers she didn't want to sign. About her mother's face in the only photo she kept taped inside a drawer. About the garage. About the word standards. She closed her eyes and played the first movement all the way through without stopping. When she finished, she didn't feel fearless. She felt certain. The next afternoon, Ridge arrived early. He didn't wear anything different. Same vest. Same boots. Savvy watched him from across the hall as he greeted Devlin and Ox with a clasped handshake and a brief nod. People noticed them immediately. A woman near the entrance stiffened. A faculty member adjusted his tie. Harrow stood near the program table, expression neutral but alert. Savvy walked over to Ridge before she could lose her nerve. "I'm announcing it," she said quietly. Ridge looked at her. "Good. They're going to hate it." "Maybe," he said. "That's not your job." Savvy searched his face. "What is my job?" Ridge's answer came without hesitation. "Play it like you don't owe them anything." The house lights dimmed slightly as the recital began. Students performed in order, each one stepping up, bowing, playing, receiving polite applause. Savvy listened from backstage, heart pounding against her ribs. She felt the weight of every rehearsal, every comment, every sideways glance. When the third student finished and the applause faded, the stage manager nodded toward her. "You're up." Savvy walked onto the stage with her folder under her arm. She didn't rush. She didn't look at Harrow. She adjusted the bench, placed the pages on the stand even though she barely needed them, and let her hands rest on her lap for one steady breath. Then she looked toward the side where the program director stood. "I will be performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, she said clearly. There was a ripple through the audience, small, sharp. Someone inhaled audibly. Savvy heard it. She didn't look up again. She placed her fingers on the keys and began. The opening came out grounded, not tentative. Ridge sat in the back row, still as stone. Devlin leaned forward slightly. Ox didn't move at all. The first movement built, and Savvy felt the months of secret practice, the weeks of brutal repetition, settle into her hands. She didn't rush. She didn't apologize. She played like she meant it. When she finished the first movement, the silence in the hall was different from before. It wasn't polite. It was attentive. She moved straight into the second. This was where Ridge had warned her. This was where they would decide. She let herself slow down. She let the softer lines breathe without flinching. For a moment, she forgot about Harrow. Forgot about the scholarship. It was just her and the sound. When the second movement resolved, she heard a chair creak as someone shifted forward instead of back. Then came the third. The part that had haunted her. The part Ridge had repeated until her wrists ached. She hit the opening with force, clean and sharp. 10 measures in, her mind flickered, just for a second, on the memory of Harrow's voice saying overreaching. Her left hand faltered. 2 notes blurred together. The mistake wasn't catastrophic. But it was there. The hall felt like it stopped breathing. Savvy's chest tightened. She could feel the old instinct rising, the instinct to shrink, to smooth it over, to survive instead of own it. And then she heard Ridge's voice in her head, not loud, not dramatic. "Don't ask permission." She didn't look back this time. She didn't need to. She reset her hand and continued, stronger. The run that followed came out exactly as it had in their apartment, relentless and clean. By the time she reached the final stretch, she wasn't thinking about who doubted her. She was thinking about finishing without apology. When the last chord rang out, it wasn't perfect. It was powerful. There was a half-second of stunned quiet before the applause started. Real applause, not the measured kind. It built fast. Savvy stood slowly, heart-pounding, and bowed. She didn't search the audience for Harrow. She searched for Ridge. He didn't smile broadly. He didn't stand immediately. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. And Savvy understood something in that nod. This wasn't over. Not yet. Savvy was still standing at the piano when the applause began to thin, not fade, just shift from surprise to assessment. She could feel it happening. The first wave had been instinctive. The second was measured. People were recalibrating. Faculty members who had leaned back earlier were now leaning forward, speaking quietly to one another. A man in the third row who had been checking his program during the Chopin performance before hers hadn't looked down once during the Rachmaninoff. Now he was nodding slowly, as if convincing himself of something. Savvy stepped back from the bench, heart still hammering, and bowed again, more out of habit than ceremony. The sound in the hall swelled one more time before settling into something controlled. She turned to leave the stage. That should have been the end of it. That should have been the moment the story locked into place. Underdog plays the impossible piece, wins the room curtain. But Savvy knew better. She had seen the way Dean Harrow watched performances, not with joy, not even with critique, but with calculation. And calculation did not end with applause. She had just reached the wing when Harrow stepped forward from the side of the hall. She didn't rush. She didn't look angry. She looked composed in the way people look when they've been waiting for their turn to speak. "Before we proceed," Harrow said, her voice carrying without effort, "there is a matter that requires clarification." The hall quieted again, faster this time. Applause has a way of dying quickly when authority speaks. Savvy stopped walking. She didn't turn immediately. She felt Ridge's presence somewhere behind the rows, steady and unhurried. Harrow continued, "Miss Cole's performance was ambitious. However, the Academy has been made aware that Miss Cole has received outside coaching that was not disclosed to the faculty." The words felt colder than the earlier insult. This wasn't about taste. It was about rules. About scholarship terms. Savvy turned slowly. "Outside coaching. she repeated not loudly, but clearly enough that the front rows heard it. Harrow folded her hands in front of her. The scholarship agreement is explicit. All instruction must be approved. Undisclosed training constitutes a violation. A murmur rippled through the audience. Not supportive. Not hostile. Curious. People love policy when it gives them something to judge. Savvy felt the air thin. She could have denied it. She could have pretended she had done it alone. But that would mean erasing Ridge. She wouldn't do that. I practiced, she said evenly. Harrow's expression didn't shift. With assistance, she replied. The implication hung there. Savvy didn't need to look to know where the eyes in the room were moving. Toward the back. Toward leather and silver hair. Harrow's tone remained measured. The Academy will be initiating a formal review. Until that process concludes, the status of your scholarship will be reconsidered. Reconsidered. It was such a soft word for something that could dismantle her life. Savvy felt heat climb up her spine, not panic exactly, but a rising clarity. This was the moment. This was what it had always been about. Not whether she could play it. Whether she was allowed to claim it. Before she could respond, there was movement in the back row. Not abrupt. Not confrontational. Ridge stood the way he had stood before, no hurry, no show. Devlin shifted to give him space. Ox opened his eyes. Ridge walked down the aisle like he belonged there, boots steady against the floor. No one stopped him. Authority is strange that way. Sometimes it belongs to the person who looks least impressed by it. He reached the front and paused a few feet from the stage. Harrow met his eyes. There was tension there now, unmistakable. Sir, she began, formal and edged. Ridge inclined his head slightly. You said she had outside coaching, he replied. His voice was calm enough that people in the back leaned forward to hear it. That's correct, Harrow said. And that violates May I? Ridge asked, gesturing toward the piano. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't defiance. It was a simple request. Harrow hesitated, and that hesitation cost her more than she realized. The room felt it. A faculty member near her leaned in as if to advise, then stepped back. Ridge waited. He didn't fill the silence. He let it sit. After a moment that stretched longer than it should have, Harrow stepped aside. Briefly, she said. Ridge nodded once and walked onto the stage. Savvy didn't move out of his way fast enough, and he had to gently touch her elbow to shift her aside. The contact grounded her instantly. He sat at the bench without adjusting it. He didn't look at the sheet music. He didn't look at the audience. He rolled his shoulders once, like he did before tightening a bolt under a hood. Then he placed his hands on the keys. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's third came out clean and full, not louder than Savvy's, not faster, just deeper. It wasn't flash. It wasn't a display. It was control. The kind that doesn't need to prove itself because it has nothing left to prove. Within 10 measures, the hall changed. Conversations that had started in whispers died completely. Harrow's posture stiffened, almost imperceptibly. Ridge moved through the first movement without hesitation. His hands didn't tremble. His timing didn't waver. When the technically brutal passages arrived, he didn't attack them. He owned them. There was no sense of effort, only inevitability. Savvy stood off to the side, watching her grandfather become someone she had suspected but never fully seen. The second movement unfolded without hurry. Ridge didn't rush the quieter lines. He didn't dramatize them either. He simply let them be what they were. There was a weight behind the notes, not heavy, but earned. When he reached the third movement, there was a flicker in his eyes, not fear, not doubt, memory. He played it clean the first time through, then pushed it slightly harder, as if reminding himself and everyone else that this wasn't borrowed skill. This was lived. Somewhere in the second row, an older man in a dark suit had gone pale. He leaned forward, hands gripping the edge of his seat. When Ridge finished the final chord, the silence that followed was not stunned. It was reverent. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the air felt suspended. Then the older man stood abruptly. That's Marcus Cole, he said, voice unsteady. I taught him. The name moved through the hall like a spark catching dry grass. Marcus Cole. Not Ridge. Not the biker. Marcus. Harrow's face shifted, only slightly but enough. The older man stepped into the aisle. Whitmore Conservatory, he continued, louder now. Class of '89. He was one of the finest students I ever had. Ridge stood slowly from the bench. He didn't look triumphant. He looked almost tired. He faced the audience, then glanced once at Savvy before speaking. Raymond Marcus Cole, he said evenly.
Whitmore. Full scholarship.
The room recalibrated again, but this time not out of curiosity, out of correction. Harrow opened her mouth, then closed it. The narrative she had prepared no longer fit. Someone near the front asked the question that had been building. Why did you leave?
It wasn't accusatory. It was human.
Ridge didn't hesitate. The night before my European debut, he said, my sister was killed by a drunk driver. The words were simple.
Direct. No embellishment. She had a son. 18 months old.
I was the only family he had left.
The hall stayed silent. Not polite silence.
Listening silence. I walked away from the tour, Ridge continued.
Drove home.
Picked him up from the hospital waiting room.
Raised him.
He paused, just briefly.
That boy grew up fine. Became a mechanic. Good man.
There was no self-pity in his voice.
No bitterness.
I didn't quit because I failed, he said. I quit because something mattered more. Savvy felt the truth of it settle into her chest in a way applause never had. Harrow looked down at the program in her hands as if it might offer her a script.
It didn't.
The academy director, Dr. Patricia Ellsworth, who had been standing near the entrance since Ridge began playing, stepped forward. Unlike Harrow, she did not wait for permission from the room. There will be no review, she said clearly. Familial mentorship does not constitute a violation of scholarship terms.
She turned toward Savvy. Your scholarship stands.
In fact, it will be expanded to full merit recognition, effective immediately. This time, when the applause came, it was unified. Not explosive. Solid. Savvy didn't cry. She didn't rush to Ridge. She stood there, absorbing the shift, feeling the word reconsider dissolve. Harrow began to clap as well. Slow at first. Then steadier. It wasn't enthusiasm. It was acknowledgement. Ridge stepped off the stage without ceremony. As he passed Savvy, he murmured quietly enough that only she heard it, "They weren't laughing at me." She looked at him. "They were laughing at you," he finished. "And that I don't allow." Savvy exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the rehearsal 2 weeks earlier. The recital moved on. Other students played. Programs were followed. But something fundamental had shifted. Ridge returned to his seat in the third row this time, not the back. Devlin clapped him once on the shoulder. Ox nodded, satisfied. Savvy sat backstage through the remaining performances, hands still tingling, mind racing but steady. When the evening ended and the crowd began to thin, Professor Gerald Ashby, the older man, approached Ridge directly. They shook hands like men who understood something about unfinished chapters. Their conversation was quiet, private. Savvy didn't intrude. She didn't need the details. She had heard enough. Later, outside the hall, as the cool night air replaced the tight formality of the academy, Savvy stood beside Ridge near the bike. "Why now?" she asked. Ridge adjusted his gloves. "Because they tried to tell you who you were," he said simply. "And they were wrong." He swung one leg over the bike, then paused. "You played it like you didn't owe them," he added. "That's yours. Not mine." Savvy nodded. For the first time since arriving at the academy, she didn't feel like a guest. She felt like she had chosen to be there. And that difference mattered more than applause ever could. In the weeks after the recital, the academy tried to return to normal, but normal had shifted. Savvy felt it in the hallways first. The looks were different. Not warmer exactly, but more careful. Students who had barely nodded at her before now stopped her between classes. "That was insane," one of the second years said, half laughing, half shaken. "I didn't know anyone our age could even attempt that." Savvy smiled politely, but she didn't correct him. She didn't explain that it hadn't been just her age on that stage. Word spread faster than any official announcement. By Monday morning, half the conservatory knew that Marcus Cole had walked into the spring recital and rewritten the narrative in under 10 minutes. Some treated it like gossip. Some treated it like legend. Savvy treated it like something fragile. Ridge did not come back to campus the next day. He didn't linger to enjoy recognition. He went back to the garage, back to engines and oil-stained rags and customers who didn't care about Whitmore Conservatory. When Savvy called him that night, he answered on the third ring. "You all right?" he asked, like the entire spectacle hadn't happened. "Yeah," she said. "You." There was a brief pause, the sound of a wrench setting down. "I'm fine." She waited. "That's it," she pressed. Ridge exhaled lightly. "What else do you want me to say?" Savvy leaned back against her small kitchen counter. You walked into my recital and turned into someone else. Ridge's voice stayed even.
No, he said. I didn't.
That landed harder than if he had bragged.
He wasn't two men.
He had never been. The academy had just never bothered to look closely enough. The next afternoon, Savvy was called into Dr. Patricia Ellsworth's office.
Not Harrow's. Ellsworth's.
That alone told her something. The director gestured for her to sit. You handled yourself well, Ellsworth began. Savvy nodded, unsure if this was praise or prelude. There is, however, Ellsworth continued carefully, a conversation we need to have about transparency. Savvy felt her shoulders tighten. I wasn't trying to hide him, she said before Ellsworth could finish. He's my grandfather.
Ellsworth studied her for a moment.
And a conservatory-trained pianist who was not disclosed as your instructor. Savvy held her gaze. He's family. Ellsworth's expression softened slightly. And that distinction is precisely why your scholarship stands. She folded her hands on the desk. But understand this, there will be people who claim this was unfair. That you had access to something others did not. Savvy let out a quiet breath. Everyone has access to something someone else doesn't, she replied. Some people just call it legacy.
Ellsworth's lips twitched at that. Fair point, she admitted.
Regardless, you earned that performance. No one can dispute that. When Savvy left the office, she felt steadier than she had in months. Not because she had been defended, but because she had spoken without shrinking. Dean Harrow avoided her for 2 days. Then, on Wednesday, Harrow asked to see her. The office door closed with the same quiet click as before. Harrow didn't sit behind her desk this time. She stood by the window, hands clasped. Your performance, she began, was technically impressive. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't a dismissal either. Savvy said nothing. Harrow turned to face her. I may have underestimated you, she said, each word deliberate. That was my mistake.
There it was. Not warmth. Not humility. But acknowledgement. Savvy nodded once.
I understand wanting to protect standards, she said carefully. Harrow's eyes sharpened slightly. Standards exist for a reason.
So does growth, Savvy replied.
The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was measured. Harrow studied her, perhaps seeing for the first time not a scholarship file but a person who would not fold easily. You will list your grandfather formally as your mentor moving forward, Harrow said at last. For the sake of clarity. Savvy didn't hesitate.
I will.
The meeting ended without ceremony. Outside, the hall felt brighter than usual. That night, Savvy drove home instead of waiting for Ridge to come to her. She hadn't been back to the garage in weeks. The place smelled the same, metal, rubber, something faintly burnt. Ridge was under the hood of a truck when she walked in. You're early, he said without looking up.
I had a meeting, she replied.
He closed the hood slowly and wiped his hands.
And?
They want you listed officially.
Ridge shrugged.
If that makes paperwork happy.
Savvy hesitated.
Harrow said she underestimated me.
Ridge studied her face. And? She almost laughed. That's it.
He leaned against the workbench. People underestimate what they don't understand, he said.
It's not personal.
Savvy looked around the garage.
You could have stayed, she said quietly.
Ridge didn't pretend not to know what she meant.
I could have, he agreed.
Do you regret it? The question hung between them, heavier than any chord progression. Ridge took a moment before answering.
No, he said finally.
But that doesn't mean I didn't miss it. The honesty caught her off guard. Why didn't you ever tell me? She asked. Ridge's jaw tightened slightly. Because I didn't want you chasing something just because I almost had it, he said. I wanted you to choose it for yourself. Savvy felt something shift inside her. All those years of silence weren't neglect.
They were protection.
You let them think you were just.
She trailed off. Ridge finished it for her.
Just a biker? He gave a faint half-smile. Letting people be wrong about you is a small price if the right people know the truth.
Savvy swallowed hard. I didn't, she said.
Not all of it. Ridge stepped closer and rested a hand briefly on her shoulder. You do now.
A week later, Savvy performed again.
Not Rachmaninoff this time.
Chopin.
The piece she had originally been told to choose. But this time it was her decision. She walked onto the stage without the same weight in her chest. The room felt different, not friendlier but honest. Ridge sat in the third row again.
not the back.
When she began to play, she noticed something she hadn't before. The softness in Chopin wasn't a retreat.
It was control.
She wasn't playing small. She was choosing restraint. That difference changed everything. The applause at the end wasn't explosive. It didn't need to be. It was steady and assured. Afterward, as people filtered out, Professor Ashby approached Ridge once more.
You should come by Whitmore, Ashby said.
Give a guest session. Ridge shook his head lightly. I'm not looking to go back, he replied.
Ashby studied him.
You already did, he said quietly.
Ridge didn't respond.
Outside, Savvy waited near the steps. They asked him to come back, she told her grandfather as he joined her.
I know, Ridge said.
Are you going to? He looked up at the academy building, then back at her. No.
Why not?
Because I don't need the room anymore, he said simply. You do. The answer settled into her chest with unexpected warmth. Over the next month, Ridge began spending 2 evenings a week at the Veterans Center 12 miles from the garage. Someone had donated an upright piano that was badly out of tune.
Devlin brought a truck.
Ox carried the bench inside without comment. Ridge fixed what he could and started teaching whoever showed up. Men who hadn't touched instruments in decades. Men whose hands shook for reasons that had nothing to do with stage fright.
He didn't advertise it. He didn't mention Whitmore. He just said, again. Slower. Listen.
Savvy visited once and stood in the doorway watching him guide a gray-haired veteran through the opening bars of a simple hymn. The man missed half the notes.
Ridge nodded once. Again, he said. There was no judgment in it. Only patience.
On the ride back, Savvy asked him, why now? Ridge kept his eyes on the road. Because I put it away long enough, he answered. And because you reminded me what it felt like to play without asking permission. Savvy leaned back against the seat, letting the words settle. The academy still had rules. Still had standards. But she no longer felt like she was fighting the room. She had already done that. What remained was the work. And the work, she realized, was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. 6 months later, nobody at the academy introduced Savvy as the scholarship student from the garage anymore. They introduced her by repertoire.
By discipline.
By the fact that when she walked on stage, she didn't hesitate. That was the real shift.
Not applause. Not gossip. Certainty.
Dean Harrow remained exacting, but no longer dismissive. Standards were still standards, but they were no longer weapons. Professor Ashby sent a handwritten note to Ridge thanking him for reminding the room what excellence looks like. Ridge never framed it. He folded it once and tucked it into the drawer beside the old brass metronome he had finally taken back out.
He didn't speak at Whitmore. He didn't tour Europe.
He didn't chase what he once left behind. Instead, twice a week, he drove to the Veterans Center and unlocked a small practice room that used to store folding chairs. The donated upright was imperfect, slightly sharp in the upper register, but he tuned it the best he could. Men showed up quietly. Some hadn't told their families they were coming. Ridge never asked about their pasts. He just sat beside them and said the same 3 words he'd said to Savvy, again.
Slower. Listen. Savvy visited often. Sometimes she played.
Sometimes she just watched. She began listing her mentor formally in every program, Savannah Cole, student of Raymond Marcus Cole. The first time she printed it, she showed him. Ridge read the line once and nodded, like that was enough. One evening after a performance, as they stood outside under a sky that felt wide and unjudging, Savvy asked him the question that had lingered since the recital. If they hadn't said anything that night, would you have played? Ridge thought about it for a moment.
No, he said.
It wasn't about me.
She studied him.
Then what was it about? He looked at her steadily. They weren't laughing at my vest, he said. They were laughing at you. And I don't let people decide who you are. Savvy felt the truth of that settle deeper than any ovation ever had. The world would keep testing her. Rooms would keep measuring her. But she no longer felt like she was asking permission to be there. She had faced the silence, survived the stumble, and finished the piece. And somewhere between the third movement and that final chord, she understood something that would outlast any conservatory, any stage, any title. Real class isn't inherited, and it isn't announced. It's proven, quietly, when it matters.